In the dense wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, hidden among the trees, there lies an iron door. Weathered and rusted, it looks as though it has been forgotten by time itself. But for three friends who stumbled upon it during an ordinary hike, this discovery would mark the beginning of an experience they could never have imagined. What they found beyond that door would change everything. Welcome to Eerie Road Tales, where we delve into real-life tales that blur the line between reality and terror. Tonight, we bring you the unsettling story of a hidden iron door in the mountains, a seemingly ordinary hike, and the nightmare that followed. Stay with us as we uncover the chilling details of what happened to Rob, Clancy, and Tiffany when their curiosity led them into the unknown, a place where answers are scarce and escape is uncertain. The story begins in the remote Appalachian Mountains, a place steeped in natural beauty but shrouded in an aura of mystery. It was late autumn, a season when the forest seems alive with color. The vibrant reds and golds of the trees stretched endlessly, their leaves blanketing the ground in a soft crunch with every step. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and decay, an ever-present reminder of the cycle of life and death. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and stretch unnaturally with the passing hours. But the Appalachian Mountains are more than just a picturesque hiking destination. Locals speak of strange happenings deep within these woods, stories that have been passed down for generations. They tell of lights seen through the trees where no trails exist, of whispers carried on the wind when no one else is around. Few venture beyond the well-trodden paths, and even fewer return with tales they dare to share. It's a place where the line between folklore and reality blurs, and perhaps that's why most stay away. For three friends, Rob, Tiffany, and Clancy, the mountains held no such fear. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, a break from the monotony of their small-town lives. Rob, the adventurer of the group, had suggested the hike. He was the kind of person who thrived on challenges, always seeking the next thrilling experience. A born leader, Tiffany quickly took charge of the group's plans, mapping out the trails and ensuring they were prepared. Fearless and headstrong, she was the one who kept them moving forward, no matter the obstacles. Clancy, on the other hand, was more of a reluctant participant. Known for his quick wit and sarcastic humor, he wasn't particularly outdoorsy, but he wasn't about to miss out on the chance to make memories with his closest friends, even if it meant a little suffering along the way. Their chosen destination wasn't the region's most popular trail. The mountain they picked was unassuming, a quiet peak that didn't attract many visitors. It was perfect for those looking to get away from it all, far from the crowds and distractions of busier routes. But there was something else about this mountain, something that added an edge of excitement to their decision. The locals called it the Forgotten Peak, not because it was abandoned, but because it was avoided. There were whispers of unusual disappearances over the years, of hikers who ventured too far and never returned. Some dismissed the tales as nothing more than campfire stories, meant to keep teenagers from wandering off alone. Others claimed there was something more to them, something rooted in the mountain's history, a history no one could quite piece together. Despite the rumors, or perhaps because of them, the three friends decided this was the perfect place to explore. Rob, in particular, was drawn to the idea of venturing where few dared to go. Tiffany saw it as a challenge, a test of their endurance and teamwork. Clancy, though skeptical, figured the worst that could happen was a weekend of sore legs and mosquito bites. Their hike began like any other. The trail was quiet, the forest serene, The only sounds were the crunch of their boots on fallen leaves and the distant murmur of a river winding its way through the valley below. But as they climbed higher, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands blocking out the sunlight. The air felt heavier, colder, and the once familiar sounds of the forest faded into an unsettling silence. Rob noticed it first but said nothing, brushing it off as a trick of the mind. Tiffany, always focused, pressed on without hesitation. Clancy, however, couldn't help but crack a joke about the creepy woods, his nervous laugh echoing through the trees. Unbeknownst to them, their decision to climb this particular mountain would set them on a path they could never have predicted. For beyond the second plateau, hidden among the trees, lay something that would change their lives forever. A rusted iron door, forgotten by time, and sealed for reasons no one dared to question. The group's hike progressed steadily through the early hours of the afternoon. By the time they reached the second plateau, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting everything in a soft, golden glow. From this vantage point, they could see the forest they had traversed spread out beneath them, a patchwork of crimson and amber. In the distance, their hometown appeared as a faint smudge on the horizon, its rooftops blending into the mist that curled around the valley below. For a moment, the three paused to take it all in, catching their breath and sharing a sense of accomplishment. Rob's forehead glistened with sweat, but he couldn't help grinning as he turned to Tiffany. She stood at the edge of the plateau, hands on her hips, gazing intently at the trail ahead. She looked as though she could keep going forever. Clancy, however, wasn't faring as well. He leaned against a nearby boulder, his face flushed, chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. "How much farther?" he muttered, his usual humor replaced with genuine fatigue. Rob laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're doing great, buddy. Just don't pass out on us." Tiffany turned back to them, her expression one of determination. "We got a little more to go before we find a good spot to camp," she said, pointing toward the narrow trail winding its way up the mountain. "Come on, let's move before we lose daylight." It was shortly after they left the plateau that Tiffany saw it. She stopped abruptly, causing Rob and Clancy to nearly collide with her. "What is that?" she asked, her voice low but filled with curiosity. Rob followed her gaze, squinting into the trees ahead. At first he didn't see anything unusual, just the same dense foliage and rocky terrain they'd been navigating for hours. But as he stepped closer, he noticed a glint of metal among the shadows. It was a door, heavy and rusted. It was set into the side of the mountain, almost entirely hidden by overgrown vines and moss. It looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades, maybe longer. The handle was a large, circular wheel, the kind you'd expect to see on a submarine or in an industrial facility. The surface was covered in patches of rust and grime, but as Rob wiped at it with his sleeve, faint lettering began to emerge. "Government property. Authorized personnel only." Clancy, standing a few steps behind, frowned. "What the hell is a door doing out here?" he asked, his tone uneasy. Tiffany didn't answer. She was already stepping closer, her eyes scanning the door as though trying to make sense of it. Rob, on the other hand, felt a strange thrill. The door was completely out of place, a mystery waiting to be solved. He reached out to touch it, his fingers grazing the cold, rough surface of the metal. "Maybe we shouldn't mess with it," Clancy said, his voice breaking the silence. There was a nervous edge to his words now, and Rob turned to see his friend shifting uncomfortably. "Come on, man, it's probably nothing. Just some old storage thing or something." But even as he said it, Clancy didn't sound convinced. Or it could be something incredible, Rob replied, his excitement growing. Think about it. Who knows what's behind this thing? Maybe it's been here for decades untouched. Or maybe it's locked for a reason, Clancy muttered under his breath. But neither Rob nor Tiffany seemed to hear him. Tiffany finally stepped back, crossing her arms as she surveyed the door. It's late, she said after a moment. We should set up camp. We can figure this out tomorrow. Rob hesitated, reluctant to leave the mystery unsolved, but he eventually nodded. The three of them turned back toward the trail, the door disappearing from sight as they continued their climb. By the time they reached the next plateau, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in twilight. The group worked quickly to set up their tents and build a fire, their earlier discovery lingering in the back of their minds. As the flames crackled and their dinner cooked, they talked about everything except the door. It was as though none of them wanted to be the first to bring it up, to acknowledge the strange tension it had introduced into their hike. But that night, as Rob lay in his tent staring up at the fabric ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that they'd stumbled onto something they weren't meant to find. The image of the rusted metal, the faint warning etched into its surface, played over and over in his mind. And then, somewhere in the distance, he thought he heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of metal creaking, like a door slowly opening. When the morning light broke through the canopy of trees, Rob awoke to an unsettling quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, were absent. For a moment he lay still, listening, a faint sense of unease creeping over him. Then the realization hit him. He hadn't heard Tiffany's usual energetic voice urging them to get moving. Pushing aside the tent flap, he stepped into the cool morning air and called out to her. Clancy emerged from his tent a few moments later, rubbing his eyes and yawning. "What's going on?" he asked groggily. Rob pointed to Tiffany's tent. It was zipped closed, her belongings scattered neatly outside, but there was no sign of her. "She's gone," Rob said, his voice edged with worry. The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. Tiffany wasn't the kind of person to wander off without telling anyone, especially not in an unfamiliar area. Clancy's brow furrowed as he looked around. "Maybe she went to the river," he suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. Rob shook his head. "She would have said something. Left a note, at least." As they began searching the immediate area, their calls for Tiffany echoed unanswered through the forest. The sense of unease from the night before had grown into something heavier, more urgent. Rob's gaze kept drifting toward the direction of the iron door. He didn't want to say it out loud, not yet, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Tiffany's disappearance had something to do with it. After an hour of fruitless searching, Rob finally voiced what was on his mind. "She wouldn't have gone far," he said, his tone firm. "Not without her gear. I think we need to check the door." Clancy's reaction was immediate. "Are you serious? You think she went in there? Why the hell would she do that?" "I don't know," Rob admitted, "but where else could she be? We've checked everywhere else. If there's even a chance she's in there, we have to look." Clancy hesitated, his reluctance written all over his face. "I don't like this, man," he muttered, but he followed Rob anyway, their footsteps crunching through the fallen leaves as they retraced their path to the door. When they reached it, the sight of the rusted metal sent a chill down Rob's spine. It looked exactly as it had the day before, untouched, unmoving. He stepped closer, his hand hovering over the circular handle. "Are you sure about this?" Clancy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rob didn't respond. He turned the handle, the metal creaking loudly in the stillness, and the door swung open. What lay beyond was a dark, narrow staircase, descending into the earth. The air that rushed out was damp and cold, carrying a sharp, chemical tang that made Rob wrinkle his nose. Clancy took a step back, shaking his head. Nope. No way. This is a bad idea. Rob turned to him, his jaw set. I'm going. You can stay here if you want. Clancy hesitated for a long moment before letting out a resigned sigh. Fine. But if we die, I'm blaming you. With that, the two of them began their descent, the faint light of their flashlights barely penetrating the thick darkness below. The staircase seemed to go on forever, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The walls were made of iron, slick with condensation. Rob ran his hand along the surface as they descended, feeling the cold metal beneath his fingertips. The air grew heavier with each step, the smell of chemicals growing stronger. Finally, they reached the bottom, where the staircase opened into a long, dimly lit corridor. The corridor was lined with doors, each one marked with faded numbers and symbols. Some were ajar, revealing rooms filled with rusted equipment and shattered glass. Others were sealed tight, their handles corroded beyond use. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, disturbed only by the faint outlines of footprints leading deeper into the facility. Rob's stomach tightened. The footprints were fresh. Clancy noticed them too. You think those are hers? He asked, his voice tight. Rob nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. The two of them followed the trail in silence, their footsteps muffled by the dust. The further they went, the stranger the surroundings became. One room they passed was filled with cages, some still containing the skeletal remains of animals. Another contained shelves of vials, their contents long since evaporated, leaving behind a sticky residue that coated the glass. Then came the sound, a faint rhythmic scratching, like nails dragging across metal. Rob froze, his breath catching in his throat. Clancy grabbed his arm. What the hell was that? He whispered. Rob shook his head, signaling for silence. The scratching grew louder, closer, echoing down the corridor. It wasn't constant. It came in bursts, pausing for a few seconds before resuming. Rob tightened his grip on the flashlight, his pulse pounding in his ears. They rounded a corner and stopped dead in their tracks. At the end of the hallway, barely illuminated by the flickering lights, was a figure. It was hunched over, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its skeletal frame was coated in a thick, black substance that dripped onto the floor, leaving a slimy trail in its wake. Two glowing eyes turned toward them, burning like embers in the dark. Clancy let out a strangled gasp. We need to go. Now. But Rob couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his mind racing as the figure began to move toward them. The scratching sound grew louder, more frantic, as it dragged itself closer. Finally, Rob's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed Clancy's arm, pulling him back the way they'd come. The two of them ran, their footsteps echoing as the creature gave chase, its grotesque form lurching after them with unnatural speed. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly before them, the exit nowhere in sight. The lights flickered and buzzed overhead, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Rob's lungs burned as he ran, his mind consumed by a single thought. They had to get out. They had to survive. Rob's legs burned with every step, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pulled Clancy forward. Behind them, the sound of the creature grew louder, its scraping, wet movements echoing in the narrow corridor. The air seemed thicker now, every breath laced with the acrid stench of chemicals and decay. The flickering lights cast their shadows erratically on the walls, making the creature's looming figure even more nightmarish. Clancy stumbled, his foot catching on a loose piece of metal, and he fell hard onto the dusty floor. Rob skidded to a stop, grabbing his arm and hauling him back to his feet, but the delay had cost them. The creature was closer now, its glowing eyes piercing through the dim light, its skeletal form dripping with the same dark, viscous fluid. It let out a low, guttural sound that sent chills down Rob's spine. The two men rounded a corner, and Rob's heart leapt as he spotted a door up ahead, larger and sturdier than the others they had passed. Without thinking, he yanked Clancy toward it, throwing his shoulder into the rusted metal and forcing it open. The room beyond was small and cluttered, filled with broken machinery and piles of old documents. Rob slammed the door shut behind them, shoving a heavy metal cabinet in front of it for good measure. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by their labored breathing. "What the hell is that thing?" Clancy whispered, his voice shaking. Rob didn't answer. He was too busy scanning the room, searching for anything that could help them. His eyes fell on a switch near the far wall, its purpose unclear, but he didn't hesitate. He flipped it up, and suddenly, the room was flooded with light. The buzzing of the old fluorescent bulbs overhead was deafening, but the light gave them a momentary sense of safety. The door rattled violently, the sound of metal screeching against metal filling the room. Rob and Clancy backed away as the creature slammed against the door again and again, its guttural growls now furious. But then, something changed. The rattling stopped. The growls faded. Rob's eyes flicked to Clancy, who was frozen in place, his face pale. Slowly, Rob stepped closer to the door, straining to hear anything on the other side. There was nothing, just silence. "Do you think it's gone?" Clancy asked, barely audible. Rob shook his head. He didn't trust the silence. It felt wrong, unnatural. But they couldn't stay in the room forever. Taking a deep breath, he reached for the cabinet blocking the door, his hands trembling. Clancy grabbed his arm. "Are you crazy? What if it's still out there?" Rob met his gaze, his expression grim. "We can't stay here. We have to get out." Together, they moved the cabinet, every scrape of metal against the floor making them wince. When the door was finally clear, Rob pressed his ear to it again. Still nothing. He gripped the handle, his knuckles white, and slowly pulled the door open. The hallway was empty. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but its trail was unmistakable. A thick, black sludge smeared across the floor and walls, leading back the way they had come. The two men stepped cautiously into the corridor, their eyes darting to every shadow, every flickering light. The silence was oppressive now, each step they took echoing like a thunderclap in the stillness. Rob's focus was singular. They needed to find the staircase and get out. But the hallway stretched on endlessly, twisting and turning in ways that made no sense. It was as if the facility itself had changed, the layout shifting to trap them within its iron walls. Then they saw it, the staircase. Relief washed over Rob as they sprinted toward it, the door at the top now visible. But just as they reached the first step, the growling returned, low and guttural, reverberating through the walls. Rob turned, his heart sinking as the creature emerged from the shadows once more. It moved faster now, its skeletal frame contorting unnaturally, its glowing eyes fixed on them. Rob didn't think. He shoved Clancy up the stairs, screaming at him to run, and turned to face the creature. With nothing but his pocketknife, he lunged at it, stabbing wildly as it closed the distance between them. The blade sank into the creature's slimy flesh, but it seemed unfazed, its tendrils lashing out and knocking Rob to the ground. The impact stole the air from his lungs, but he managed to roll away as the creature pounced, its teeth snapping inches from his face. Clancy's voice echoed from the top of the stairs, shouting for Rob to move, to get up. Summoning every ounce of strength, Rob drove the knife into the creature's eye. It let out a deafening screech, its body convulsing violently, and Rob seized the moment to crawl toward the staircase. Clancy reached down, grabbing his arm and pulling him up the steps as the creature thrashed below. The two men burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them. Rob collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for air, his body trembling with exhaustion. The sunlight was blinding after the darkness of the facility, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Clancy broke the silence. What the hell just happened? Rob didn't answer. He couldn't. His mind was too consumed with the horror they had just escaped. But as they sat there, trying to make sense of it all, they heard a voice, a familiar voice. Turning toward the river, they saw her. Tiffany. She was standing waist-deep in the water, her expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What happened to you two? And why are you covered in blood?" Rob stared at her, his mind racing. She looked unharmed, as if nothing had happened. But if she hadn't gone into the facility, who or what had led them down there in the first place? The sight of Tiffany standing unharmed by the river raised more questions than it answered. How could she have been there all along? Why hadn't she responded to their calls? And most disturbingly, if she hadn't entered the iron door, then what? Or who had left those fresh footprints in the dust below? For Rob and Clancy, the experience inside the facility was beyond explanation. The abandoned hallways, the grotesque creature, the endless sense of dread. It all felt too real to dismiss. But what was this place? Who had built it, and for what purpose? The faded government warnings suggested it had once been a controlled environment, but now it felt like a forgotten experiment left to decay. The cages, the vials, the skeletal remains, they pointed to something dark, something that had gone terribly wrong. As they recounted their ordeal later, Rob couldn't ignore the lingering feeling that they had been drawn to the door for a reason. He couldn't shake the memory of the creature, its glowing eyes burning into his mind every time he closed his own. Was it simply a guardian, meant to keep trespassers out? Or was it a remnant of whatever had once taken place within those walls? And if it had been there all this time, how many others had ventured into the facility before them and never come back? Then there was the silence of the town. When Rob and Clancy tried to tell others what had happened, they were met with skepticism, even dismissal. It was as though the mountain itself held some unspoken pact to keep its secrets buried. Those who had heard of the iron door claimed it was just a story, a fabrication meant to scare off hikers. But Rob and Clancy knew better. They had seen it. They had lived it. And the blood on Rob's shirt was a stark reminder that the horrors they had faced were not a product of their imagination. But one question lingered above all others. Why were they allowed to leave? If the creature was as deadly as it seemed, why hadn't it pursued them beyond the facility? Was it bound to the confines of the mountain, or had it let them go for a purpose? For Rob, the thought was chilling. He couldn't help but wonder if the real danger lay not in the creature itself, but in the fact that they had escaped to tell its story. Some say the iron door still stands, hidden among the trees on the mountainside. Others claim it was sealed long ago, its secrets buried forever. But whether it's there or not, The story of what lies beneath the Appalachian Mountains serves as a reminder of humanity's fragile understanding of the unknown. What was once forgotten has now been remembered, and perhaps some doors are better left unopened. What do you think lies behind the forgotten door? Was it truly an abandoned government facility, or something far more sinister? Could the creature Rob and Clancy encountered have been an experiment gone wrong, or perhaps something older, something beyond human comprehension? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the mountain holds its secrets tightly, and those who dare to uncover them may not always return. For Rob and Clancy, the ordeal left scars, both physical and psychological. Tiffany may have been unharmed, but she will never fully understand the nightmare they lived through. And perhaps that's for the best. Some truths are too horrifying to share, too dangerous to confront. But for those of us hearing their story, we're left with a choice. Would you have opened the door? If this story has left you questioning what lurks in the shadows of the unexplored, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more tales of the unexplained, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to Eerie Road Tales. Your curiosity fuels our journey into the unknown. Until next time, remember, there are places in this world that were never meant to be found. And sometimes, what lies behind a door is far worse than what you could ever imagine.